I want to remind everybody that the handouts do not include the footnotes, which I've tried to develop for every element that you'll find in my presentation today. And I've used both pro-CRT and opposing views in my research. And previously there was distributed a 14-page bibliography handout, which includes many, if not all, of the resources I've accessed. There are probably a lot more that I've happened upon since then, but I want to do a little bit of, next slide please. I'm going to do a little bit of recall from session 1. For those of you who weren't here, we talked about the origin of the word race and its use in literature. We determined that race is a social construct devised by man. In fact, 3 billion base pairs of genetic letters in humans are 99.9% identical in every person. We examined the life of Karl and his development of taxonomy. And the reason we're referred to as Homo sapiens, how he was the first to categorize man with animals, and his eventual categorizations that included moral, sociological, and psychological characteristics of man. And that's where he ran off the rails, as we say. We talked about Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and how he came to develop the classification Caucasian. So if you ever wondered why you might be called a Caucasian, he's the reason for that. And I won't go into the details now, but it was in the last time we spent together. The influence of Franz Gall and the father of pseudoscience phrenology. And finally, Dr. Samuel Morton, who started the first school of American anthropology and his role in the establishment of scientific racism. Next slide. I want to encourage all of us to seek the meaning of the terms being used, and I would ask you to remember John Stonestreet's admonition, it's useless using similar words if we are using different dictionaries. So, the title of today's talk is Ideologies Have Their Consequences, an introduction to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And so, you're going to ask me, what's the word ideology mean? Well, actually, it was coined in 1796 by Antoine Destoute de Tracy, and it originates from the French word ideologie, itself deriving from combining two Greek words, idea, which we know well, a notion or a pattern, and logia, the study of. So it's the study of a pattern or a pattern of ideas. So today we are looking at Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And you should ask, why these two? What was their relationship? Why isn't it called Engelism instead of Marxism? And you can see from the time the dates that are there that they were roughly contemporaries. But even before we get there, I want to remind all of us that, as Pastor Matt says time and time again, context is always important. So let's look at these aspects of history. Next slide, please. So, from the 1500s to the 1780s, the feudal system was in place, and then the Industrial Revolution comes about. And then in 1776, the American Revolution, and in 1789, the French Revolution. And in 1848, Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto. And then in 1914 to 1918, World War I, and then came the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Revolution, Trotsky and others, used the Communist Manifesto as the basis for which they undertook the revolution. And in the 1920s and 1940s, the Frankfurt School in Germany began, and also known as developing critical theory. And we're going to hop into that our next time, but I just wanted to give you that context because that'll help us understand what these two men are all about. The next slide. All historical figures are influenced by others, and Marx and Hegel are no exception. Hegel was the forefather of Marxism, and as one commentator stated, the most impenetrable Western philosopher you will ever read. So how important is he? The quote that I show you here is from a French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and it reads, all the great philosophical ideas of the past century, the philosophies of Marx and Nietzsche, phenomenology, German existentialism, and psychoanalysis had their beginnings in Hegel. Next slide. So, what is a dialectic? No, it's not a current dance craze. According to the Oxford Classical Dictionary, it is the science of conducting a philosophical dialogue. It actually means a conversation. We get our word dialect from that. And they're exploring the consequences of premises asserted or conceded by the interlocutor. And all that means is there is a conversation between two people. So we're looking at that. So that's kind of the foundation of that. Aristotle considered Zeno as its founder, and Socrates' method of cross-examination was a further landmark in the history of dialectic, but it was his pupil Plato who formally developed the idea of a dialectical science, and was probably, coined the term dialectic itself. But it was likely, in the next slide, Heinrich Moritz Chalybäus, who characterized Hegel's dialectic as Marx would have used it, positing a triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Now I want you to hold on to that thought, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But thesis, this idea, then you have an antithesis, an opposing idea, and through that conversation, through that dialectic, you come up with a synthesis. And this is what we're going to see as a way of looking at history that Marx and Hegel undertook, and we'll get into that in a minute. So the next slide, please. I want to walk through this. I want to give you some dates in the lives of both of these men and some aspects we'll talk about more in a minute. So obviously a good place to start is that his date of birth was the 5th of May in 1818. He was the eldest son and second eldest child of 8 of the lawyer Heinrich Marx and his wife Henrietta, whose maiden name was Pressburg. And in November of 1820, Friedrich Engels is born in Barman, Prussia, as the oldest of 9 children of the cotton manufacturer Friedrich Engels and his wife Elizabeth. Now keep that in mind, a cotton manufacturer. So they are part of the wealthy class. In 1835, Marx, at 17, is enrolled by his father at the University of Bonn. He wanted him to be a lawyer just as he was, despite his wishes to study philosophy and literature. And of course, Marx will have his way. In April of 1841, he received his PhD by the University of Jena, where he submitted his doctoral thesis, The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature. Now, I have not read his dissertation, but you can see that this is a bright man, very intelligent, was an excellent student, studied a great deal, and we'll see later on he spent hours and hours in the British Library. The next slide. November of 1842 was the first encounter that Marx had with Engels as he was visiting the newspaper where Marx was the editor, the Rheinische Zeitung, on his way to England. And in 1842, Engels meets Mary Burns, a young working woman with radical opinions. And he begins a relationship that lasts until her death 2 decades later. And they never marry. So here again, I'm putting all this together so you can see relationships of individuals with others and the influence that this may have had. Now, I used politely the word working woman. There's some conjecture that She may have been even a prostitute, it's not known, but it is the fact that she was a person who took him around Ireland. We'll see that in a minute, looking at various living conditions. So you have those who are poor, those who are richer, coming together, and we'll see what that results in. In June, Marx marries Jenny von Westphalen and later moves to Paris. Now, she later in her life referred to herself as a baroness. She too came from a very wealthy family, and she lived an absolutely horrible life in her marriage to Marx. Their first child, Jenny, is born in Paris in 1844, and then Marx meets Friedrich Engels at the Café de Régence in Paris, and this is the second encounter that becomes the start of their lifelong friendship and intellectual collaboration. And continuing on, I'm just going to go through these. I want to see this. Under pressure of the Prussian government, Marx is expelled from Paris and moves to Brussels. So he's, in often cases, editing radical newspapers because of his radical opinions, and in some cases fomenting insurrection against the government. He's thrown out of one country into another country. They have a second daughter, Laura, and then in the 29th of November to the 8th of December in 1847, they participate in the first Congress of the Communist League in London, and Marx is asked, along with Engels, to write a manifesto on behalf of the group. And then Jenny and Karl Marx's eldest son, the birth of Jenny and Karl Marx's eldest son, Edgar, in Brussels. In 1854, the youngest child, Eleanor, is born in London, and then their son, Edgar, dies in London at the age of 8 from gastric fever. And then Marx's mother, Henriette, dies in Trier in 1863. On to the next slide, please. In 1867 is the publication of the first volume of Das Kapital, which is Marx's influential analysis of political economy and the criticism of the capitalist mode of production. In 1870, and the following year, Engels writes 60 articles on the Franco-Prussian War for the London daily newspaper, the Pall Mall Gazette. Then Marx's wife, Jenny, dies in London after a long illness. And in 1883, at the age of 38, Marx's eldest daughter, Jenny, dies probably from cancer of the bladder. And in 1883, Karl Marx dies. And after that, Engels dedicates himself to the editing and publication of their works, which were numerous, and I'll get into that in a moment. And then in 1884, Engels publishes the second volume of Das Kapital. And in 1893, after 9 years of work, Engels publishes the third volume of Das Kapital. So they had together written these 3 volumes, but the first one was the only one that came out in Marx's life, and the other 2 came out after his death. And in 1894, Engels dies in London of throat cancer. And I've continued on, and if you'll make 2 changes for me, that should be 1898. At the age of 43, Eleanor Marx commits suicide after discovering that her partner, Edward Aveling, had secretly married a young actress in June of the previous year. And then in 1910, at age 66, Marx's second daughter, Laura, commits suicide together with her husband, Paul Lafarge, outside of Paris. So let's take a look a little bit more at the lives of these 2 men. As I said, Marx was born in this home that I've shown here in Germany on May the 8th in 1818, and the picture there is of him as a student in 1839. what were some of the things that he was writing as a youth? If you look at the next slide. Thus heaven I forfeited, I know it full well. My soul once true to God is chosen for hell. See this sword, this blood-dark sword which stabs unerringly within my soul. Where did I get this sword? The Prince of Darkness. The Prince of Darkness sold it to me. The hellish vapors rise and fill the brain until my heart goes mad, until I go utterly insane. And this poem was significant enough, it's called The Player, that it was published in 1841 in the Athenaeum, where Marx was, when Marx was 22 years of age. So this is stuff that's coming out of him even at a young age. But as we'll see on the next slide, what were others saying about him? His father said he thought he was governed by a demon. His own son said, "My dear devil." Engels said of him, he was the minister of 10,000 devils. His wife called him a wicked knave. Numerous friends referred to him as Faust or Mephistopheles. And Robert Payne, one of his biographers, wrote, he had the devil's view of the world and the devil's malignity. Sometimes he seemed to know that he was accomplishing works of evil. So, on the next slide, when Marx returned from his first year at the university, just a few months after his 18th birthday, he and Jenny became secretly engaged. Now, her parents were not at all enamored with Marx, and it took a while for them to come around. 6 years later, Marx completes his doctorate, and Jenny overcame resistance from family members, and she was 4 years older than Marx, and the two married. I thought this was really interesting, and I don't know if any of you have tried this, but I certainly didn't. But Marx brought luggage containing more than 40 books on their honeymoon. So I told you he was quite a student. He was well-read, very learned, but what will he do with that? Then interestingly, in 1845, Jenny's mother sends Helene, her nickname was Lenchen, Demuth, to the Marxes to assist the pregnant Jenny in caring for her growing family. I think any of you moms would say that would be wonderful if my mother-in-law would send someone to me or my mother would send somebody to me to help me out with the family. And she proved an invaluable aid, a kind of Engels for the home. She did a lot of the bookkeeping and administrative work and so forth. But Marx fathered a child with Demuth. On the next slide, you'll see a picture of Jenny von Westphalen. She was quite attractive in her youth, but they said as she progressed in her later years, and particularly in the conditions in which they lived, that she just withered away, as it were. Now, about that affair that I just referenced. Next slide. There's no mention of it in any of the Marx family's letters, just allusions to a bleak time when Marx complained that at home everything's always in a state of siege, and declared himself infuriated by floods of tears that poured from his wife. I think she had a great suspicion as to what had taken place, and you can imagine what that does in a marriage. And Jenny's memoirs were equally mum about their turbulent home life. In the early summer of 1851, an event occurred which I do not wish to relate here in detail, although it greatly contributed to increase our worries, both personal and others. Now, the child was named Henry Friedrich Demuth. Henry perhaps for Marx's father, Friedrich for Engels, the man who later claimed paternity of the child to save Marx's reputation. And the boy was left to a foster family and spent his life trying to prove that Marx was his father. and he received absolutely no support whatsoever from Marx. And next slide. Helene Lenchen-Demuth was not apparently in any kind of respectable relationship at that time, so young Freddie was fostered out. And the Marx children assumed, or rather were helped to believe, that frequent visitor Engels was responsible. And Karl was having an affair with Helene while his wife was pregnant with Jenny Eveline. And his letters from the time mention that he went into hiding in the British Library for many days when Lenchen's pregnancy would have been discovered. The death of Edgar, the Marx's third born at the age of 8, became Marx's greatest suffering as a father. He wrote to Engels, "It's a good thing that since the day of the burial I've had such furious headaches that I can't think or see or hear. In all the terrible agonies I've experienced these days, the thought of you and your friendship has always sustained me, and the hope that together we may still do something sensible in the world." The next slide. So a little bit more about Friedrich Engels. You can see him there as a youth, and then later on. Before meeting Marx, Engels had written, "I pray every day, indeed almost all day, for truth, and I've done so ever since I began to doubt." And even before meeting Marx, he'd heard about him. Engels wrote this poem: "Who comes rushing in impetuous and wild, dark fellow from Trier, in fury raging, nor walks nor skips, but leaps upon his prey, in tearing rage as one who leaps to grasp broad spaces of the sky and drag them down to earth. Stretching his arms wide open to the heavens, his evil fist is clenched. He roars interminably, as though 10,000 devils had him by the hair." Now, as I reminded you, Engels was a member of the bourgeoisie. For 40 years, he would provide financial support for Karl Marx, and he himself maintained lodgings in one part of the city of Manchester and rented rooms in the financial district, and he was a polyglot. He learned 12 languages and was fluent in them, and taught himself the Persian language in 3 weeks. Again, a great mind. And why were they drawn together? Because they had similar opinions, and I think Marx was the one who kind of led Engels down this path, and it was upon Engels that he was dependent for his support throughout his life. So, the next slide, this is the family house at Barman. I think it's pretty handsome even by today's standards. His father was part owner of a factory in Germany and part owner of one in England. And when Engels ran into trouble with his writings in Germany, his father sent him to England to get him away from what was going on. The next slide, Manchester in 1870. It's a picture shown here. You can see the factories and the smoke and the smoggy conditions. Engels would live here for 28 years, and it was the largest industrial town in England and a noted center of the profitable cotton trade. And where do they get their cotton from? The southern states of America. We'll turn to the next slide. On the left, you'll see Mary Burns, who we took up with for more than 2 decades. And to the right, you will see her sister Lydia, also known as Lizzie Burns. And after Mary dies, I'll go ahead a little bit. After Mary dies, he takes up with her sister, but on her deathbed, he marries her because that's what she wanted. The next slide, you'll see the interior of an Irish hovel during the Great Famine of 1845 to 1850. And Engels toured Ireland with Mary in 1856 when almost every village still suffered from the consequences of the potato famine. And one other story I wanted to relate to you is that when Engels' longtime paramour died, Mary Burns, Marx sympathized, next slide, Marx sympathized briefly. But the remainder of his missive, there was one line where he said it, I extended his condolences. But the remainder of the missive was devoted to a long account of Marx's woes, ending with a plea for money. All my friends, Engels fired back in anger, including Philistine acquaintances, have shown me at this moment, which hit me deeply, more sympathy and friendship than I expected. You found this moment appropriate to display the superiority of your cool intellect. Now imagine writing this note to his longtime friend and starting out saying, I'm sorry, but then saying, but things around here are very terrible. 23 lines, I think it is. I mean, he kind of went through everything that was happening, and oh, poor me, and by the way, I need some more money. And this almost broke the relationship, but within a week, Engels was again sending him money. So that's enough about some of their background. Let's go on now to say, what did they reason together and come up with? Next slide. Marx envisioned an apocalyptic revolution leading to the overthrow of capitalism, the bourgeoisie, and that's just a fancy way of saying city dweller. That's all that means. By the impoverished working class, the common people, the masses, the so-called proletariat. And dictatorship would be a way station. Get this. Dictatorship would be a way station on the road to the ultimate utopian goal of a classless society. The state in the process would be abolished. With a classless society, class antagonisms would disappear, as would world conflict, as would social inequality. Society would evolve from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. Remember when we were talking about the dialectic? How those two, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, they looked at history as kind of progressing this way. But socialism would need to sweep the planet in order to work. It had to be worldwide. The next slide. This hopefully will illustrate a little more clearly some of their thinking. And you can see it's noted in here. And I actually took this slide from a person who is very much a Marxist, but I think it's fair in representing. You'll see there the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then how that works through history, according to them. You'll see in the Roman days, the slavery, the patricians and the plebeians. If you ever wonder why somebody say, I'm just a plebeian, and even the Naval Academy, the plebes, anyway. Feudalism, the aristocrat and the bourgeoisie, then capitalism, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and then we move on from there. Now, when we talk about critical theory, and I'll get into this more the next time we gather together, why is it called critical? This German political philosopher, Honor Rouge, received a letter, received a letter from Marx, and he said, there can still be no doubt about the task confronting us at present, the ruthless criticism of the existing order. We say that again, the ruthless criticism of the existing order. Ruthless in that it will not shrink, it will shrink neither from its own discoveries nor from conflict with the powers that be. All right, our next slide. One of their more famous works is called The German Ideology of 1845, and they wrote that for the widespread generation of this communist consciousness and for the success of the cause, it is necessary for man himself should suffer a massive change, which can only come through a practical movement, a revolution, overthrowing the old filthy yoke and founding a new society only in revolution. Now, Marx is seen as a philosopher, a political economist, but his most consistent income, other than Engels' support, came as a journalist. He wrote for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune as a way to publicize his and Engels' views, a total of over 500 articles from 1852 to 1862. The newspaper at the time was the largest in the world, with a circulation of over 200,000. And for all intents and purposes, there was no English translation of the Manifesto published before 1888, some 5 years after Marx died. So if you're wondering how these ideas were disseminated throughout the world, that's the power of the pen is quite evident here. And I don't think a lot of people realize that this 500 articles in the New York Tribune, which, as I said, was the largest newspaper at the time. The next slide, please. Marx was an atheist utopian who envisioned a new reality without God. The classless society, which would be a workers' paradise, would, said Marx, make its own history. It is a leap from slavery into freedom, from darkness into light. The social principles of Christianity preach cowardice, self-contempt, abasement, submission, humility, scowled Marx. The social principles of Christianity are hypocritical. So much for the social principles of Christianity. I want to give you one other little tidbit here. A year after writing the Communist Manifesto, Marx's landlord evicted him because of non-payment of rent, and the apartment being very poorly kept. Marx abhorred work that would receive a salary. It's as I said, his work as a journalist was providing the steadiest income other than that which Engels provided for more than 40 years. And the household suffered because of it. His mother said, "I wish he would do more about making capital than writing about it." A year after writing the Communist Manifesto, Marx's landlord evicted him because of non-payment of rent and the apartment being very poorly kept. Marx drank too much, smoked too much, never exercised, and suffered from warts and boils all over his body. His back, his face, his bottom, the bridge of his nose, and also all likely from lack of washing. At one time or another, the boils appeared on all parts of his body. They brought on a nervous collapse marked by trembling and huge bursts of rage, wrote one biographer. The boils got so bad at times he could only stand upright or lie on his side on the sofa. Now, in this next slide, I found this absolutely fascinating, and to be honest with you, I'd really never thought about it much. I'd heard the word dystopia, so what would be the opposite of dystopia? Utopia. But it's not. Here's the reason why. Sir Thomas More was the first person to write of a utopia, a word used to describe a perfect imaginary world. Moore's book imagines a complex, self-contained community set off an island off South America. He coined the word utopia from the Greek uitopos, meaning no place or nowhere. It was a pun. The almost identical Greek word eutopos means a good place. Think of euphonious or euphemism. At the very heart of the word is a vital question. Can a perfect world ever be realized? It's unclear as to whether the book is a serious projection of a better way of life or a satire that gave More a platform from which to discuss the chaos of European politics. So that word U, letter U, topia, is nowhere. It's an imaginary place. And I think that's instructive for us today. Next slide, please. Communist Confession of Faith. This was the draft title of the Manifesto before opting for the final title. Think over the Confession of Faith a bit, Engels wrote to Marx in November of 1847. I believe we had better drop the catechism form and call the thing Communist Manifesto. One of the most disturbing books I think I've ever read is this one. It's called The Devil and Karl Marx. It's by Paul Kanger, who is a professor at Grove City College. And in this, and I've used a lot of this in my notations, in this book it talks about Marx and his, he had an atheistic theology professor, go figure, and just the things that they would do in desecrating communion and all kinds of things. It's a very disturbing book, and looking at his life. But you can imagine his tongue-in-cheek. Well, they have their catechism. Let's call it the catechism, the Communist Catechism, or Communist Confession of Faith. This was happening quite frequently in his life. The next slide, please. Okay, all of you should know this. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. That's the opening line of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which we'll refer to as the Manifesto. And in it they write, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, the oppressor and the oppressed. Now, I'll get into it in a minute, but I don't know whether you realize it or not, but there are 3,000 colleges across the country which have as required reading the Communist Manifesto. I'll be honest, I had read parts of it, but not all of it until recently. And I'll spare you today, but I'll tell you what they came up with in their 10-point plan within the manifesto. So I think this is instructive for us in understanding what it's all about. First, about abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. So there'll be no private property. A heavy progressive or gradated income tax. The abolition of all right of inheritance. The confiscation of all property of immigrants and rebels. The centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. The centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Think about that. What's happening today with our platforms? This very talk may not be allowed to be shown on YouTube because I'm speaking things which are not agreeable to those who control the, not the airwaves, but those platforms. It'll be interesting to see. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands. Next slide, and the improvement of soil generally in accordance with the common plan. So they looked at even the land and how it's used and so forth. The equal obligation of all to work. The gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a core equitable distribution of the population over the country. I mean, as we all know, the cities, particularly in the United States, have grown tremendously. And there are many demographers who look at that and say, you know, you have these areas where it's more rural, less populated, but the power seems to be directed to those who control these larger cities and so forth. And here they have them trying to force that out. We haven't seen that yet that I'm aware of, but maybe that's to come, who knows. And free education for all children in public schools. And Marx said, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. And they also wrote, with an exclamation, abolition of the family. Now that even goes down to the role of husband, wife, and children. In the next slide. A communist society will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter which concerns only the persons involved and into which society has no occasion to intervene. It can do this since it does away with private property and educates children on a communal basis, and in this way removes the two bases of traditional marriage: the dependence rooted in private property of the woman on the man and the children on the parents. So we can see how that fits into what we as Christians believe and how we operate within our own lives. So, and in the next slide, as we noted in our timeline, in 1867, the first volume of Das Kapital was published, and this is an analysis of political economy and the criticism of the capitalist mode of production. And I want to go on to the next slide if we can. This, I think, shows what they were trying to express, and again, this comes from a Marxist organization, but I think that they have captured it fairly well. You see the base there. Everything needed to produce a society's wealth. This forces of production, land, factories, machines, materials, relations of production, social relations formed by production, and then that in turn shapes the superstructure. And superstructure is things that don't have to do with the production of a society's wealth. That's politics, education, media, family, religion, laws, etc. And the superstructure legitimates the base. And we're going to take a look at that next time because this is a lot of what informs what they're trying to do, and Antonio Gramsci will actually do this when he talks about hegemony and he talks about the robes. And the robes are those who are in the courts, those who are in the schools, those who are in the churches, and that influence will come about. And then the next slide, I think, will even represent it a little more clearly. The superstructure, Marx saw that certain structures act to support the financial power base. The two ways that this can happen is via repression or ideologically. So the repressive structures, the army, the police, and the legal system. And when you hear the chant, defund the police, when you hear that critical race theory comes out of the legal community, and no less than Harvard, you'll see that this is what they see as repressive structures, and also the ideological structures, the schools, religion, and families. So, next slide. Marx continues to refine his ideas set out in the first volume for the rest of his life. And as I indicated, the next two volumes would not appear in print until after his death. And these ideas would go on to spur revolutions in Russia, China, and many other countries around the world in the 20th century. The ruling elites were overthrown and private property was seized on behalf of the workers. The next slide. He'd already set out his ideas on class struggle and how the workers of the world would seize power from the ruling elites in the Communist Manifesto and other writings. And as I indicated, Das Kapital is an attempt to give these ideas a grounding in verifiable fact and scientific analysis. And Marx argues that an economic system based on private profit is inherently unstable. Next slide. Owners and other capitalists hold all the power because they control the means of production, allowing them to amass vast fortunes while the workers fall deeper into poverty. You can see where this is the genesis for the whole idea of equity. And you can see in some cases why it's attractive to many. You know, why should this person have more than I have? Shouldn't we all have the same amount? And if you look at capitalism as being those who own the companies, invest their time, energy, and resources to develop an idea, and then hire people to assist them, and they do that in the capitalist system, why should that be? Why should I have less? Why should I not have the resources that they have? Next slide. Owners and other capitalists hold all the power because they control the means of production. It's an unsustainable way to organize society. Did I already do that? Yep, sorry. All right. Oh, not clear about when this will happen, only that it's inevitable. Marx doesn't spell out what the communist society that will replace capitalism will look like, only that it will free workers from their servitude. So here again, that whole idea of utopia, no place. What's the end game? What are they looking toward? And that they don't have an answer for. And neither do the anarchists, those who would, the Antifa folks. Next slide, Marxism, slide 45. Marxism became a way of interpreting the world. At its core, history was a battle between opposing social classes, and it could be applied to everything from the study of literature and film to the education system. And it became a byword for totalitarianism, as one-party states and dictators proclaimed Marxism as their guiding philosophy. The Soviet Union's collapse in the early 1990s dealt a major blow to the credibility of Marxist theory, and it went out of fashion on university campuses and in mainstream left-wing political parties for a time. The next slide. It underwent something of a revival in the wake of the 2008 global financial crash, which some saw as a classic example of capitalism in crisis, just as Marx had predicted. Remember the Occupy Wall Street activities? According to a 2020 Gallup poll, 45% of Americans say they would vote for a socialist for president. And I found that this may be a reason that it's not better understood. The U.S. spends about $50 of federal funds per student per year on STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And many people now actually convert that name to STEAM. They add art in there as well. So you can see there's a great disparity. And civics really isn't taught in school anymore. And we'll get into it a little more next time, but Congress is underway through the Department of Education and a commission to look at civics instruction, how it's to be done. And there are many who are very fearful that what they will propose being the accepted instructional materials will not be anything that alike what we would want to have. So that's something we really need to pay attention to. On to the next slide. This is a note by Engels to the German edition of Das Kapital or Manifesto in 1890. The proposition, Communist Manifesto, which in my opinion is destined to do for history what Darwin's theory has done for biology. We, both of us, had been gradually approaching for some years before 1845 in terms almost as clear as those in which I have stated it here. So they had a plan and a purpose and a goal of this being as influential as Darwin's theory of evolution. In the few minutes that we have left, I want to share just a few things with you. On the next slide, this happened just last week. This is a notable and quotable from the Wall Street Journal. And this is a professor of classics at Princeton who gives in his video orientation to all incoming freshmen. And I would refer you to where the red arrow points. Instruct and guide them about the institutional peculiarities of Princeton and Princeton culture. That's not what he wants to do. But not with a view to habituating them into a practice of assimilation or indoctrinating them in the belief that somehow this is the best damn place of all, but in order to supply them with the tools with which they can tear this place down and make it a better one. So, what are the results of Marxism? The next slide. This is a Harvard publication. It's called The Black Book of Communism. Those who have undertaken this ideology, I said ideology has consequences, is the title of the talk today. It's approaching 100 million deaths. You can see the numbers there, the USSR 20, China 65, Vietnam, North Korea, Cambodia, Eastern Europe, and so on. Think of that, 100 million deaths. And so when you have people that say, oh, socialism isn't so bad, let's just give it a go. Why wouldn't that work? Think of what it has already wreaked and just in terms of lives. And some of you may watch the YouTubes or heard the lectures of Jordan Peterson. I thought he had a pretty good point. The next slide. Religion was the opiate of the people. That was written by Marx. But Marxism was the methamphetamine of the masses. And I chose to illustrate that with, this is meth mouth. Those who are on methamphetamines. This is what their mouth actually looks like after a period of addiction. Next slide. Ayn Rand said there is no difference between communism and socialism except in the means of achieving the same ultimate end. Communism proposes to enslave men by force, socialism by vote. It is merely the difference between murder and suicide. And oftentimes you can look at cartoons and things that will give you a sense of how things are, what's the difference between socialism, communism, and capitalism. In the next slide, you've probably seen this before. Socialism, you have 2 cows, you give one to your neighbor. Communism, you have 2 cows, the state owns both and gives you some milk. In traditional capitalism, you have 2 cows, you sell one and buy a bull, your herd multiplies and the economy grows, and you sell them and retire on the income. So that's kind of a light look at that. Just some for what it's worth, and next slide. I told you that Marx's mother, her maiden name was Pressburg. She married Lyon Phillips, and Marx, he had a fairly good relationship with them, but because they were wealthy. They did give him some money. But Lyon was also the executor of Marx's mother's estate. And so Marx actually barred against what he felt would be the inheritance he would receive. So when she died, he didn't attend her funeral. He said, well, I'll get this money, but he'd already borrowed most of what the inheritance was. But this Phillips is the ones who started the Philips Corporation, which still exists today if you've ever bought any Philips electronics. And two other things. Next slide. I'm sure many of you have seen these memes. I don't always start a revolution, but when I do it with class. And a question which many of you have been asking, if it's about teaching historic truths, then why is it called theory? The next slide. For this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. John 18:37. And I'll close with this slide. It's right at the hour of 12, the bewitching hour. Cheryl and I had the privilege of going and seeing the Van Gogh. And I know we all say Van Gogh, but my friend who is Dutch said it's Van Gogh. And we don't like to say guttural sounds like that, so we usually say Van Gogh because it's nicer. That's why he signed his paintings Vincent, because he said people didn't know how to pronounce his name, so he just put Vincent on them. But in any case, we had a chance to go and see the Immersion Experience, which is in Northeast Washington. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, I'd highly recommend it to you. Cheryl can tell you more about it, and I think some of you that are here have seen it already, and some are going. But I've always been enamored with Vincent, and just to think that in his asylum room, he painted this picture. And many don't know, but he was a great fan of Charles Haddon Spurgeon, read many, many of his sermons. And he had himself been a preacher at one time. But you see the intensity, the illumination of the heavens, and just the smaller lights that are in this dark city. And I'd just like to think that perhaps he saw truth, he saw light, that it's God-given truth that we should be after, and that's why that's so brilliant in this painting. So as we all labor to understand what's taking place in our society, I would ask you to consider more of the facts about Marxism, socialism, and ask questions. Because a lot of times when you talk with people, and Buddy and I have talked about this before, when they say critical race theory, ask them, what do you mean by critical? Why is it theory? What about race? Aren't we one race? Be willing to engage people in conversation and indeed inform yourself through your own dialectic. So thank you for your attention today, and Pastor will be bringing more next week, and then the week after I will be doing a section on Antonio Gramsci. It was in Italian, but I'm going to spend most of the time looking at how this has influenced our culture in various ways, in ways that many of you would probably never expect it would. So thank you, God bless, and have a safe remainder of the day. Thank you.